So I'm really excited to introduce you guys to our next panel, Corporate Accountability Advocacy Centering Impacted Communities Experiences, and also to introduce you to our three excellent panelists. So one of the issues we wanted to highlight with this panel is the significance of the disconnect sort of between where corporations are based, where a lot of corporate accountability advocacy takes place, and then also where corporations choose to conduct most of their work, where a lot of their supply chains are based, and then also where the impacts of corporate abuse are felt. There's a significant impact there. And so governments play a critical role in holding corporations accountable. And what this means is that usually the home countries of different corporations are the ones that end up being best suited to pursue accountability against those corporations. Those governments work closely with advocates and activists who are interested in holding corporations accountable. But many of the corporations that are involved in human rights abuses around the world are based primarily in the global north. And what that means is that governments and advocates within the global north are developing a lot of the corporate accountability legislation that we're seeing. But the real impact of those laws are felt in other countries. And so I think one thing we want to highlight here is that it's really important that bridges are built to resolve that impact. I think also for a lot of countries where corporations do have their supply chains based, there's sometimes a lack of political will to hold corporations accountable. Sometimes corporations aren't necessarily beholden to those laws or don't feel accountable to those laws, and so may not necessarily respond sort of respond to court judgments. And so there's sort of a lack of accountability there, and that's sort of why it ends up the home states of a lot of these corporations, which are, I think, a lot of the times the US and the EU end up being, and countries within the EU end up being the places that sort of have the most power to hold those corporations accountable. And one example that's illustrative of this is gave rise to the Justice for JSR campaign, which is led by our colleagues at GLJ ILRF. And along with GLJ ILRF, we at ICAR co-hosted an event as part of the Justice for JSR campaign speaking tour. Let me tell you a little bit about the incident. So JSR Katharevu was a 20-year-old garment worker at a factory called Nachi Apparel in Tamil Nadu, India, that supplies to H&M among other corporations. She was sexually harassed and intimidated by her supervisor for months before he allegedly murdered her in January of this past year. Her local union claims that she tried to report the harassment, but no action was taken. They also suggest that sexual harassment and abuse are common in the factory. And actually, after the situation where she was allegedly murdered, 25 other women from Nachi Apparel have come out and complained of facing sexual assault and harassment at the factory at the hands of the supervisors as well. So H&M has launched an investigation into the case, but there are really few options for holding H&M accountable and for failing to detect these really significant human rights abuses in the first place. But also, I think one thing that's important to highlight is that those who are impacted by corporate abuse in this way, people who suffer as a result of this should not be reliant on corporations remedying a situation after the fact only. There need to be legal safeguards in place that make it so that corporations know ahead of time not to work with suppliers who may be abusing human rights. So I think one thing that's significant is the mandatory human rights due diligence movement to codify human rights due diligence into law that's happening throughout Europe. This is something that's sort of intended to solve this problem, and we have yet to see kind of what it'll look like. But it highlights one way that legal safeguards can make it so that businesses find it more in their interest to comply with human rights norms than it is to violate them. And I think Jenna mentioned in the last panel as well, the concept of harnessing the FCPA for a human rights approach And I think it's important to kind of think through the different ways that legislation can be put in place to ensure that corporations are prevented from violating human rights. And in developing laws like this around corporate accountability, I think it's really important that advocates in the US and the EU not only take into consideration, but center the experiences of impacted communities. So this includes what kinds of human rights abuses are most salient in these communities, what solutions they would like to see, and then also what solutions they've seen work in shifting and changing corporate behavior. For corporate accountability legislation to be successful at combating corporate abuse, I think advocates who are working on this primarily in the US and the EU need to be working with advocates in communities that are facing this directly. So as we think through how the US and also countries in the EU can be better at holding corporations accountable for human rights abuses throughout their supply chains, we've been working closely with our three panelists and the groups that they're a part of to identify what's most important for the US to prioritize in legislation that holds corporations accountable for human rights abuses in their supply chains. So our panelists are three activists from Bangladesh, Mexico, and Uganda who are interested in and working directly towards improving corporate accountability legislation. So I want to take a minute to introduce all three of them. So joining us first today is Miguel Soto, who is the Engagement, Advocacy Campaigns, and Public Relations Director at the Project on Organizing Development, Education, and Research, or PODER. PODER is a corporate accountability organization that leverages business intelligence, transparency, technology, and community organizing to improve corporate transparency and accountability in Latin America and to strengthen civil society stakeholders of corporations as long-term accountability guarantors. We're also joined by Joseph Byomuhangyi, who is the project coordinator for the Uganda Consortium on Corporate Accountability at the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, ISER, and it's an organization that seeks to promote the effective understanding, monitoring, implementation, and realization of economic and social rights in Uganda. And last, but of course not least, speaking to the situation in Bangladesh, we're joined by Zaman Ashraf, who is a human rights activist based in Hong Kong at the Asian Human Rights Commission. He's also a core member of Odhikar, which is a Bangladesh-based human rights organization. I want to thank all three of you for being here, for joining us, and I will turn it over to Miguel to start.
Thank you. Thank you, Noor, and thanks for the invitation to share with the audience and the kind of work that we have been doing. And thanks also for the panelists for sharing also the stories, and for ICAR to let us present here. Well, what is the case about that we have been working here? It's the Iztaca mining project owned by the Canadian firm Almaden Minerals. Is located in the municipality of Ixtacamastitlan in the Sierra Norte region of Puebla in Mexico. Although this open-cut gold and silver mining project is still awaiting the permits to begin the exploitation phase, the negative impacts from the exploration phase have already been felt by communities in the region. According to research conducted by specialized technical and scientific teams, the project, if approved, would cause irreparable and serious violations of the rights to water, the environment, and the health of the inhabitants of the communities, and would create further conflict over land and water. This company is in the United States and the Canadian Stock Exchange. So communities in the region have been defending themselves against the mining project for more than 10 years. PODER has accompanied them in this struggle since 2014. And we have supported the community defense strategies, primarily through strategic research and advocacy and engagement work with the public policy decision makers and also with the investors. 3 years ago, together with the Unión de Ejidos and Comunidades en Defensa de la Tierra, el Agua y la Vida at Colua, and the local organizations CESDER and INDEC, we conducted the first human rights impact assessment with the participation of communities. More than the participation, it was led by the communities. and drew significant conclusions about the company opacity and lack of accountability. Additionally, other allied organizations have documented violations to the right to free, pure, informed and consent process. Last year, the civil society organizations that have been assisting and accompanying this project have seen an increase in persecution and harassment of human rights defenders who oppose the mining project in the municipality and in the region. By the end of the last year, the community achieved a huge victory against the corporation because the Ministry of Environment declined to give the permit to the mining group. And after that, we have seen a shift on the strategy of the corporation. Now they have created a new narrative on the benefits of the community, for the community, and they have created a human rights narrative. They call it policy, but it is just a narrative. And the effects that have occurred are right now, after a lot of interviews and being with the community, it's a breakdown of the social and community fabric, because some people are in favor of the project and others are against it. They have tried to co-opt the population to obtain the social license to operate. There are families that have distanced themselves and the communities, and a social conflict has been generated. In environmental terms, the water table has been damaged by the drilling of the company. The company tells to the investors that they are drilling at a certain depth, but this is not true according to our research and according to the research of the local community. This has caused people to lose their springs and access to water. These are immediate impacts, and they are concerned about drought because the region suffers from it, and the company plans to use 5.3 million liters of water per day for the operation of the mine for 4 years, and starting from year number 5, they will use 11 million liters of water per day. Water is one of the most important concerns, one of the most important threats for the community. Another important problem is that part of the territory is concessionized to the mining company without any consultation process for the population, which violates the right to consultation and free and informed consent, as I said before. There are other rights that are being violated, such as the preferential right to the territory because they live there and grow their food there. They are also fighting for water and for the forests, and they should have the right to territory. The human rights to water and healthy environment will be affected as well, and there is also a risk of forced displacement of the population because people would have to leave the place where the mining project is being carried out. Just to share with you some information about the company and its processes. The company is a subsidiary of Hamadeh Minerals called Minera Gorrión. It is a junior company. Regarding the omissions made by the company when making an environmental impact assessment, the company denies that there are indigenous communities, explaining that the company wants to make the existence of the community invisible. It has the storyteller has pointed out that this is a desert zone, and this is and the company said that this is a non-productive zone, and that only the company can generate and provide employment, and it denies the indigenous identity. Through consultants, they carry out studies to officialize the denial of the existence of the community. And according to one of the community members, they say they want to silence us and make us invisible. The company says that they did a social impact assessment that they never made public, by the way. And that was after we, the organizations and the community, made public our human rights impact assessment. And according to the people that we have talked about, they say what the company did was to investigate the deficiencies of the communities and made a kind of anthropological work to extract information to be able to consolidate their work, which they call community engagement. According to the community members, they say they want to use our needs to control us. And however, this was not an official consultation process. If we talk about the role of the federal government, the municipal and local authorities, the federal government has concessionated the territory through the Ministry of Economy. There is a very difficult situation with the competences of Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Environment. So the state has opened the door to the mining company. The government presented the mining company at the beginning as kind because they accompanied them in the presentation of the company, where they gave, for example, to the community wheelchairs, another kind of donations to get a kind of the Lawson social license. The municipal government has not wanted to make any decision. That is what they say publicly. That's according to the people that we have interviewed. But in their actions, that directors of the mining company have direct contact with the municipal presidency and have a physical presence there. That they have an office right there. Within the municipal development plan, they have considered some incomes from a fund created from mining activities. So there is a certain acceptance on the part of also of the Canadian government on this. And we can go a little bit more on that later, maybe in the Q&A session. From the advocacy processes, one of the interviews says, Alejandro is one of the people that we have been talking about, reports that a human rights impact assessment was conducted together with other organizations. Poder was one of them. And in general terms, this impact assessment exercise had a strong influence at the community union level. This work has given the communities the tools to argue why the project should not be carried out. They said as well that the Mexican authorities are not articulated, and the responsibility for the decision making and permits granted is passed from one to the other. And just to give you one example, if you go to the community was there having a conversation with the Ministry of Economy, and the Ministry of Economy said, no, this is not my competence, my issue. You have to go with the environmental. If you go to the environmental office, they will ask you to go to another one. So that's a kind of frustrating for the people and also for the organizations. From the security level, there have been subtle threats. In the community, the mining companies, the directors said that the Mexican army would protect the mining company interests. There has been that kind of intimidation. There is a lot of disqualification of the community because they are called unruly, they are called troublemakers and opponents of development. Regarding an eventual due diligence law in the United States, according to the people that we have talked about and our research, there are some elements that we can go deep later as well. They said there should be a law because the guiding principles of business and human rights leave it to the goodwill of the companies and investors, to the goodwill. They said that there should be a more formal regulation and not just ethical or goodwill principles. They consider that one of the principles is the right of the consultation and free consent. And respect for human rights, such as respect for healthy environment, respect for human right to water, because they can. Oh, sorry, I put my watch here. Those are some of the human rights that have been under attack if this project goes there. So. We have had some testimonies. We have some testimonies from the people on the ground, from community leaders, from farmers, from housewives, head of the people at home. And there are some. These are some of the conclusions right now. Just to end this participation, we can let you know that the community. It's being organized right now. there are some important victories last year. By the end of the last year, the government denied the permission after a lot of work from the community and the organizations. The strategy was focused to get this permit denied by the authorities, and however, the company is going to present another request. We can go deep on that, but I think I'm gonna stop here so we can hear the testimonies of my colleagues here. Thank you very much, Noor.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Thank you. I think I'll pass it over to Joseph. If you can tell us a little bit about the work that you guys have done and what you're seeing in your communities.
Thank you so much, Noor, for hosting and moderating this discussion. It's evening in Kampala. My name is Joseph Byomuhangyi, and I coordinate the Uganda Consortium on Corporate Accountability. Speaking about advocacy, we have really worked so hard to improve the legal and policy framework when it comes to issues of business and human rights at the national level, that is here in Uganda, at the African level, but also internationally. I am happy to share with us that Uganda adopted a national action plan on business and human rights, and it will be launched on the 28th of this month. But in as much as we have domesticated the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, we are equally contributing to the review of the third draft of the legally binding instrument, such that the complementary aspect of the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights and the legally binding treaty are realized to improve the situation of pursuing corporate accountability. Going directly to the advocacy around mandatory human rights due diligence, I am here to share a story from the western part of Uganda, for those of us that have been here, particularly in the district of Kabalori, where a family and the communities neighboring that family rented out their land to a third-party company that extracts pozzolana. Pozzolana is a raw material used to manufacture cement, and cement is a building material. So this company, Seahorse International, extracts pozzolana and takes it to HIMA. HIMA Cement is a subsidiary of a multinational corporation. It's a French-Swiss multinational corporation called Lafarge-Holcim. They do trade or business in building materials. So after extracting this pozzolana, the third-party company never reconstructs the area from which they've extracted the pozzolana and leave a bare ground that is not arable, and yet the community is arable. They grow crops and also rare animals. So we discovered that it's a big challenge because this particular person I'm going to share with you went ahead and sued the third-party company and has a judgment from the courts of Uganda. But impunity reigns so high that even with his judgment, the company doesn't care because of the relations to the powers that be in the country. And even when you reach out to the subsidiary HIMA, it says, no, that's really none of our business. It's a third-party company. And yet there is an existing agreement between the third-party company and the subsidiary of Lafarge-Holcim, a French-Swiss multinational. So we believe that with the mandatory human rights due diligence laws in the global north, we'll be able to bridge that gap in lack of accountability. So I'm going to request Taj to kindly play the video such that people can follow the story. Thank you.
On 6th January 2016, a company called Seahorse International Limited came to me requesting me to rent land so that they can extract pozzolana to take to HIMA. On that agreement, we agreed that each lorry that is taken, they pay me 20,000 shillings. And after which, they should cover the area where they have extracted land. They convinced me that they shall restore the topsoil. unfortunately, after extracting the pozzolana is so deep down. You have got to dig with an excavator about 15 feet down so that you can get the real pozzolana. So after digging it 15 feet, the soil, the topsoil, formed a sort of a hill. And out of it, the soil down cannot be used for anything. It is very unfortunate. It has caused me a setback economically. My animals cannot graze because they cannot climb that hill. Climbing that hill means instant death because the soil is about 15 feet.
We see that the supply chains perpetuate the abuse of human rights, but also the destruction of the environment because no one is then responsible for that damage. HIMA, the subsidiary of Lafarge Holcim, will say, we contracted a different company to bring to us these raw materials. They do not pay attention to the harm that this company is doing in the communities where they are getting the raw materials from.
I was compelled to take them to court. Court judged a case in my favor. They told them to compensate me for the time I had not used the land. And the court ordered them to cover the area, of which they failed. I'm requesting Lafarge to intervene and see that my soil is restored and be compensated for the period I'm not using this land, as the court had ordered. I have documents regarding that effect.
The Initiative for Social and Economic Rights is really focused on ensuring that there is advocacy globally for the adoption of mandatory human rights due diligence laws, especially in the global north, because we have seen that the supply chains of these companies like Lafarge Holcim, which is a French-Swiss multinational dealing in building materials, and particularly the subsidiary they have here in Uganda, HIMA Cement, is focused on the manufacturing of cement. So when we bring these stories out and portray the abuse of human rights in the supply chains, we want to make a case for the adoption of mandatory human rights due diligence laws in the global north, because we believe it will be pertinent in addressing the abuse of human rights in the supply chains, but also in protecting the environment. Thank you so much, Taj, for sharing that video, but it's extremely clear that we need the mandatory human rights due diligence laws to bridge this gap, because even with a court judgment from the courts of Uganda, the person telling the story is unable to achieve justice, is unable to achieve remedy. But we believe that with the mandatory human rights laws, then it would be the concern of Lafarge Holcim and its subsidiary HIMA Cement to ensure that there is no abuse of human rights in their supply chains. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joseph, and thank you really for sharing that video. I think it highlights very clearly why these types of laws are important. Zaman, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Noor, and I thank all of you to host this program. It's very important to talk about corporate accountability. From Bangladesh, there are many sectors of workers, but in today's meeting, being mindful to the time we have, I will stick to the most popular ones, the ready-made garment sector, which has a lot of Western investments and engagements to talk about. So the whole world knows that clothing are made from the developing countries, and Bangladesh is one of the largest dressmakers, ready-made garments makers for the global shopping malls. And in that, we have a reality that nearly over 70%, close to 80% workers are female. So in that context, if we look at the industrial sector, it has a very poor working condition with few exceptions. There are very few big companies which has some kind of reasonable safe environment. But in most cases, the working environment is very much unsafe for the workers in terms of emergency exit doors and the space they are provided and the kind of other safety arrangement, first aid, treatment facilities. So all that, when we take into consideration, it's completely unsafe and also unhygienic for the workers. It's an overcrowded working condition. And then from the employing company, they hardly have any binding obligation for following the rules, whatever should be the standard, considering the human rights standard, or the if you look at the ILO standards, or all these big companies, they say that their business accountability or business and human rights accountability from that perspective, they hardly follow any kind of binding obligations, and there is no regulatory authority to oversee that. I will come to that point later. If you look at the wages that are given, it's between 100 to 150 US dollars per month to live. And let me tell you, in Bangladesh, living cost is not much less. I mean, if you compare the commodities price, food grains and other stuff, then it's not much cheaper than what it costs in the United States. And so people have to compromise their required, nutritional requirement for their living, health requirement, educational requirement. So all that they have to give up and just live like a bonded slaves. Then if you come to the aspect of leave, so the mandatory leaves, workers not provided, sick leaves are not provided. It's basically like day laborers. You have a job, you get your salary once in a month, if the company is a good one in terms of the payments. But if for any emergency reason, one day you are absent, suddenly sick, then for that day, no pay. Even you have a risk to lose your job. Even if someone is late, then certain portion of their wage is deducted for that. 1 minute late, few seconds late. So in that kind of very harsh and arbitrary use of rules against the workers is the norm in this system. Then if you look at the male-female discrimination part, men are paid higher than the women. Having the same skill, same kind of workload, everything same, even and with the risk of various kind of abuses, including sexual abuses, they are less paid. And then denial of maternity leave, of course. And if you get pregnant and you seek maternity leave, so it's like you are given the leave without a guarantee that your leave will be paid. And then you may get your job back when you come back to work. So there is hardly any guarantee unless you have somebody to favor you within the company. At the same time, if the company suspects that someone may complain to any people like human rights groups or media, then they have their own goons. I mean, paid people in the neighborhood who will be watching you all the time. You are under surveillance physically. So everyone will be followed whether somebody or the suspected one is going to reveal any information or communicate with anybody about the problems going on in their job. So in that sort of condition, you are also prevented from participating in the trade unions the formal way, while these big companies, they insist that you have to allow, the employing companies have to allow the workers to join trade unions. So when they meet, the companies who are coming from Europe or America, then the Bangladeshi employers are agreeing that, okay, there is no problem. But then at the workers' end, they will be doing everything possible to prevent the workers so that they cannot actively participate in the trade union activities. So there is an absolute double standard in place. The one interesting character of these employers is that they're very much connected to the power in Bangladesh. The political power, if you look at the owners of Bangladesh's largest organizations, that the members, the owners of the garments companies, it's called BGMEA. So if you check the background of these BGMEA members or the factory owners, you will find a lot of retired military officers, police officers, bureaucrats, and also the politicians. And of course, the politicians are mostly from the ruling party, or either way, if they are from the opposition, they will be still connected to the influential people who control the power. So with that, they have a couple of advantages. One of that is they can manipulate the way they want. I'm just talking about the workers' rights issue without going into the money laundering and other aspect of the crime that they're involved with. But if they deprive the workers from pay, like suddenly, if the owners demand their salary at a particular time, for example, if you have a festival coming and all the workers expect that they will be paid before the festival, which is few days earlier than the normal date of the company when they pay, like 5th to 10th of the following month after working for a month. So what will happen? They will simply refuse. And there are many instances that the law enforcement agencies came and they basically arbitrarily arrested those workers who protested or demanded their wages, or detained them arbitrarily, and also brutally tortured them. So it happens because of the relationship. The owners of the factories, they belong to the side of the political power, the power structure. And the workers are the helpless. They can hardly join the trade unions. Or if somebody is a recognized leader or organizer, but then he or she needs to know where is her or his limit to, do the things. So the moment they cross the limit, so there are consequences. And the consequences are like what Aminul Islam had faced. Aminul Islam was a worker trade union leader. He's a very good organizer in Bangladesh, and he was disappeared by the law enforcement agencies. And later his body was found floating next to the street. So in one of the highways. So nobody, and that's how they have given the lesson to everybody, that if you try to be too good, then your fate will be too bad, like what Aminul Islam had faced. So with that message, the trade union leaders, activists, they have to set their own boundaries. That, okay, this, beyond that, we should not speak out. The other part is that what we need to see when we talk about accountability is there may be accountability possible in United States or any countries of the European Union, particularly the western part of the EU countries. But if we talk about accountability within the Bangladeshi boundary, then we need to ask that, does the Bangladeshi judicial system function? That should be the first question. And the answer is a big no. The justice mechanism that is in place in Bangladesh, it's absolutely dysfunctional, and it acts at the behest of the ruling executive authorities. I can cite many examples. If anybody has interest to that, I will respond to that. So from that system, we cannot, the workers cannot expect anything just in their favor. I mean, I quote it just. So that means justice for the workers or their groups is unthinkable in the given system. We cannot find an example that somebody has approached to the court to seek remedies for deprivation or discrimination in the industrial job, particularly in this sector or other sector, and then the court has given a remedy to that. It's very hard to find in the case. And then, people also, the poor workers, they cannot afford paying the cost of the litigation, which is extremely expensive for them, who hardly survive within like $100 to $150 per month with their family. Often the family is about 4 members family, at least, husband and wife with 2 kids. So if both persons are even working, so the entire family's income is like $300 US. You can imagine what their living standard in that case. So and the dysfunctional justice mechanism, it is possible when the government has no obligation or no accountability to the public. And how it is possible? Because the country doesn't have any electoral system in place. The system is rigged. So it's rigged in a way that, like if I talk about the immediate latest election that Bangladesh experienced, 29th of 30th December 2018 was the day set for election. The government rigged the election on 29th evening. 29th December, overnight, all the ballot stuffing were done. So in the following morning, people were just queuing up, and then the polling booth, the centers door were not open. And in few places when it was open, and they were not given a ballot. In places they were given ballot, but then said, okay, you have to stamp on the on the ballot in front of all of us. All of us means who are sitting inside the room, the polling officials and the ruling party goons. So in that kind of electoral system, the government itself doesn't have a political or legislative accountability to its own people. And then every judge they appoint at the highest judiciary or at the lower judiciary, so they have the freedom of using their arbitrary powers, mostly, always politically motivated. Then the appointment of law enforcement officials, the intelligence agencies officials. So all these are also politically motivated. So it doesn't work professionally. The entire system itself doesn't function with professionalism, and it also is incapable of protecting people's rights. In contrast, Bangladesh has the record of hundreds of enforced disappearances, which is happening regularly, extrajudicial executions that involve many of the poor workers, and a lot of sexual abuses against the workers, the female workers in place, without any affordable or accessible remedy. So in that system, if we talk about corporate accountability, so it's simply impossible to think about. So then we need to think from the other side, that from developed places who have reasonably visible commitment to accountability, democracy, and rule of law in countries like United States or the EU countries. So are they willing? Are they sympathetic to the workers of Bangladesh? So if they are, then they need to act. How? So one of the first thing is that, okay, this entire investment process will be reconsidered unless the democratic system and the functional rule of law systems are not in place. Otherwise, you can't hold anybody accountable for depriving rights. And when we talk about this particular one sector, RMG sector, workers' rights, we are talking about few millions of workers. So it's a big community. So if anybody has a true commitment and at the same time sympathy or obligation to the people, to the workers, and corporate accountability, then there has to be a system in place which would be functional to hold people accountable. The corporate companies of Bangladesh and also the international companies, the multinational companies who are investing partners or beneficiaries from that so-called cheap labor available in Bangladesh. So I will, I don't know whether I have taken more time that I was expected to. So I will stop now, and I would be happy to respond to the questions. Thank you very much, Noor.
Thank you so much, Zaman. I think everything that all three of you have said highlights how important it is to recognize the distinctions in the ways that corporate human rights abuse plays out in different places. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then we can open it up to the audience, to the chat for any additional questions that any of you guys have. But I wanted to start off by asking, I think we mentioned sort of the mandatory human rights due diligence movement as it's moving forward. And so I guess I'm wondering two things relating to that. One is, what do you see as necessary within any corporate accountability or mandatory human rights due diligence legislation in order for it to be successful? What is necessary for that to be include in it? And then also I'm wondering, from your experience, from what you've seen from officials or corporations on the ground, how do you see them? How have they perceived existing mandatory human rights due diligence legislation and the movement? I guess I'm wondering if you're seeing that they're worried about it. Is it changing their behavior? And what your thoughts around that are. So I'm not sure who would like to begin, but I guess I'll open it to all three of you. Go ahead, Miguel.
Thank you, Noor. Well, for us, there are like we have seen some reactions from the private companies. I think that some of them, they're still thinking about that this is not going to happen to them. They are still thinking that this is a conversation from the global north that is not going to arrive to countries like Mexico. But we have seen some changes in the narrative of those private companies. At least this one, that on the case that I have shared with you, we have seen that that company, and there's another huge company called Grupo Mexico that it's all over the world. They have made some public statements on human rights issues. However, those are some empty messages, because on the field they haven't made any change on the way on how they are operating here. And that's just to let you know a kind of thing that we have seen in the last months. They have been doing that kind of public statements on their web pages and all of that. There are, based on our experience, on your question on which elements should be important to a due diligence law, we have three elements. First, it has to be like based on the a legislation should be co-created with the participation of the communities and civil society organizations. All of the stakeholders in the universe of this legislation should be included. It cannot be created just by one legislator or a couple of lawyers. And we are saying that because here in Mexico there was an attempt to create a human rights due diligence law that it was really bad, and it wasn't serious because it was created just for a legislator and his team of legislators. The second thing is that any kind of mandatory due diligence law, it needs to be supported by the guiding principles on business and human rights. And the third thing is that any legislation on that pathway should be really well articulated with another local human rights legislations. Here in Mexico, and going back again with that example, that kind of initiative was not articulated with the human rights law related to victims. There's another local law related to forced disappearance and related to compensate the victims, and there was no connection between those initiatives. So it's important to get all of those connected, and to make sure that, I think that's a fourth element, and to make sure that any legislation on that way should not give more power to the private companies. In this attempt, the private companies were allowed to sue or to make any legal action against the state if the state fails in their tasks or in their mission to make the due diligence process. So private companies were allowed to go against the state because they were allowed to say, no, it was not me, it was the state, so I'm going to make a legal action against the state. So fortunately, that law was not serious, and it is not like deleted, but those are some important elements from our experience in the field and with the civil society organizations. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Noor. I think I should come in next. Is that fine?
Yeah, of course.
All right. I'll start with the second question. How have the corporations on ground paid attention to issues of mandatory human rights due diligence? And I'm going to share an experience we've had recently with the biggest brewery, AB InBev. I don't know if people have heard about it. The African compliance manager reached out to us after having watched the research we've done documenting the abuse of human rights in plantation agriculture, particularly the sugarcane sector in eastern Uganda. We have a video, and recently we also launched a research early this year that looks at child labor, particularly in the outgrowers section. Having looked at the research we had produced, they reached out to us to seek ways upon which they could improve the situation of curbing child labor in their supply chains. One of the sugar companies in Uganda is in their supply chains. So in as much as they are a very big multinational corporation, a very big brewery, they couldn't sit there and watch a company in their supply chains featuring in reports of child labor. They reached out to us and asked for how best they can implement the recommendations we had made in that research for the company. So to some extent, there is really change for some of the companies, especially those that are from the global north. The greatest challenge is going to be with the Chinese investments the state-owned enterprises from China, they totally do not pay attention to issues of human rights. Though recently, in September, I saw a Chinese human rights action plan, and I'm really hoping we shall use that tool at least to begin the conversation. But it's so bad in our country when it comes to the Chinese state-owned enterprises that are doing most of the construction infrastructure projects. So we have lots of labor challenges, and also the host communities are facing the abuse from the employees of the Chinese state-owned enterprises doing the construction. With regards to question one, I think what is necessary for mandatory human rights due diligence legislation to be successful is to involve the stakeholders. Everyone in their different roles should be involved in the process by raising awareness to know about them and to clearly highlight their role in the process of achieving the purpose of mandatory human rights due diligence. Thank you so much.
So it seems to be my turn now. Okay, I mean, very briefly, I mean, what my two other panelists have already mentioned, and without repeating anything, what from Bangladesh context, what I would say that most of the international organizations, including some certain organs of United Nations, IOM and others, they all work with the government. There is a notion in the multilateral bodies that we need engagement with the government. So to make sure that they keep up the engagement with the government, they ignore that the legitimacy part of the government. They ignore the human rights record of the government, and which is catastrophic, that many human rights organizations say. So so that is one. But I would say that still there are rooms for the UN mandate holders on the business and human rights. They should be allowed to visit the country and see things thoroughly and make a study of their own to, come up with their own findings, that how they need to intervene and how the rights of the workers can be protected, how remedies can be provided, and at the same time, the corporate accountability can be ensured. So there is a huge denial of access to the information regarding this. Human rights groups have to work, more than the normal course that people should be doing in the case of Bangladesh because of huge suppression and surveillance against independent human rights activists. So keeping that context in mind, there should be engagement from the external human rights groups and involving the trade union groups who are sincerely committed to improve the situation, improve the level of accountability, which is almost zero now. And then in the long run, there has to be the plan of how to, long run means, I'm not saying in 20 years, in years' time, as quickly as possible, how to transform the political and the judicial system of the country, while political system is authoritarian and the judiciary is dysfunctional and subjugated. So unless these things work together, so it's to me, it's like an orchestra. If everybody doesn't play their, instrument with the right rhythm and tune, then you cannot have the best music. So if we want to see the accountability taking place, so that has to be domestically, there has to be a very regular, continuous oversight by the experts who understand the issues. And from the international part, for example, when the companies are coming from North America or EU countries, so they need to uphold their human rights principles from those states. Because until you do that, you just allow your companies to go to one or a couple of developing countries and just exploit the poor people's labor who are forced to be the modern day slaves. That should not be allowed in today's time. We are in the 21st century. So now we need to demonstrate our commitment that, okay, human rights, when we talk about the world as a global village, so the global village doesn't only include the United States or Canada or a few countries. Global village should include all the countries involving the north and south of the globe. And then everybody's rights, everybody's accountability should be the concern of the global villagers. That I would say. So from their side, the investors should be also warned that when you are going to these places, so these are the conditions. We have the human rights commitment, which should remain, which is on the top. And then if it doesn't meet the standards, then we don't want you to be there. Just the principle should not be that wherever there is a money, we should jump over that. So that I would say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zaman. I think one thing that all three of you brought up was the importance of collaboration with among different stakeholders relating to corporate accountability or business and human rights. You highlighted the importance of sort of stakeholder collaboration in improving corporate accountability legislation. So that sort of brings me to my next question. I guess I think this panel, like I said in the beginning, was to highlight the importance of centering the experiences of impacted communities. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, what do you think advocates in the global north, in places like the US and the EU, what do you think is important? What role do you think they should play in centering impacted communities' voices? How should they be doing that best from your perspective?
So do you have to follow the order? Yeah, I see Miguel's hand is already there. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mohammed. I think there's they have to find a way to get connected to the local communities. For example, in Mexico, the United States representation here, maybe, and also the European Union embassies here, they have a relation with civil society organizations, and sometimes they have direct relation also with the affected communities, and we can always help to open the conversation with the communities. Sometimes the communities are not they don't feel like very comfortable to have a direct conversation with authorities from other countries. But sometimes if there is a very respectful approach with them, a conversation can be opened directly with them, or maybe with the civil society organizations that also accompany the communities, because this is the most important thing for them, like to be really engaged with the development of the issues that affect them directly, and that would be like one of the points, and we can help with that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to really try and stretch the responses I'm giving to this particular issue. Definitely the mission here, the US mission in Kampala, keeps in touch with us in terms of tracking issues of business and human rights, labor users, different engagements. That relationship is there. But for me, my request would be the Global North should enact the mandatory human rights due diligence laws, because from the story I shared, it's very clear that if Lafarge Holcim knew that they were bound in the supply chains, they would not, their subsidiary in Uganda would not say they don't care, it's none of their business what Seahorse International, the third-party company they contracted to deliver pozzolana to them, did to the communities. They would know that it's their responsibility to follow up on the supply chains and ensure that the human rights are not abused and the environment is protected. But also, the Global North should support the enactment of the legally binding treaty. We are really, really calling on the Global North to support.
I think maybe we lost Joseph for a second.
Any treaties as you lost me? Are you able to hear me?
We can hear
now?
you again now. Yeah.
Okay.
We can hear you now.
Sorry about that. The internet is a bit unstable. I was saying that the Global North should support the legally binding treaty with regards to transnational corporations. Currently, the politics seem to suggest that the EU bloc is more into having national action plans and also the domesticating the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And my submission is that in as much as the UN guiding principles on business and human rights are very good with a protect, respect, remedy framework, we need the complementary aspect of the legally binding treaty to be able to effectively protect the victims of corporate human rights abuses, especially in the global south. Key of the challenges we are seeing with the UNGPs is that the third pillar, access to effective remedy, is really lacking. So I believe when we have a legally binding treaty supported by the Global North, as a whole, we would have made a great stride in protecting human rights in aspects of business enterprises. Thank you.
There is one thing, I mean, of course, I agree with what Joseph and Miguel said. I mean, the supply chain aspect and the legislation. One of the thing is that there has to be also certain transparency, or at least to establish the rational and the reasonable. I mean, if you look at the pricing, the cost at the end of the factory that this global north, the companies, big companies are paying, and what in the American or European shopping malls, the same like shirt, what they're selling, it's 10 times higher, the price often. So there has to be some kind of transparency in that. You make investment, you earn money, but that cannot be disproportionately, I mean, so different. You are spending like $10 for making a shirt in Bangladesh and selling it in the United States $100. That's not acceptable. So certain transparency should be established there. That okay, because when you know that how much is your around the cost that you are spending for that, then the American people, the consumers, they can also understand the reality that okay, then how much would the workers would have got from the for working in the process. And then the many people who are also making profits throughout the channel. That is one area which also needs to be regulated to at some form in the global north. And then it has to be scrutinized through independent human rights groups from both the global north, involving the human rights activists of the global south, so to make the process more transparent that how the rights are being ensured for the workers and the entire process involving the environment of work and the pay and the leave and all these things. So if what is more important that in the case of United States and other countries who are pretty powerful in the global politics is geopolitics becomes bigger priority than human rights. So there has to be also priority for human rights more than geopolitics, or at least equal. If you treat it equally, so you need to think about the human dignity of the person, where the people are, I mean, contributing to the process to help your economy, and whether those people's human dignity are being denied or deprived through your inaction or through your negligence. So that aspect should be covered in the law. And law always, I mean, I don't like law, to deal with everything. There has to be, the sincere commitment. If law can do that, it's fine. Otherwise, you need to find the other approaches so that area could be covered. And that is one of the things that I have previously said, that the international experts on that for holding the business human rights accountability part, they should also be engaged. But while I'm saying that, we also need to know that Bangladesh government doesn't extend the invitation to the UN special procedure experts for years, except few things like drinking water, safe drinking water, sanitation, that type of mandate. But like the serious crimes of human rights violations issues, they don't allow the special procedures mandate to visit the country. And repeatedly they're giving reminder, and Bangladesh is happy to ignore that, reject that. So in that condition, it's we have to come up really with something that is going to work in a place. So, and it also has to work at the end of the factory owners and at the end of the government officials and the party or regime in place. So if it involves everybody, that everyone needs to play their role responsibly, then things will gradually change. Nothing will happen overnight, will gradually change, because the workers, human rights activists, they will slowly, they will get more space, more room to act, and then they will have more chances to contribute to the process so that it improves, and then we will see improvement. But we have to really put our collective efforts into that.
Thank you so much, Zaman. I want to thank all three of you, Miguel, Joseph, Zaman, for taking part in this panel. I know for me it was a really valuable discussion, and I hope our participants felt the same way as well. I think I'll turn it over to Taja to wrap up